Riku Hayashi knew exactly what kind of person he was. He had known it since the first day of middle school, when a boy twice his size had looked at him, laughed, and walked away, and Riku had stood there with his lunch tray and understood without anyone explaining it that there were people who occupied space in the world, and people who were simply tolerated inside it. And he was the second kind. He was 16 years old, overweight in the specific way that teenagers are overweight when food has become the only thing that doesn't judge them. Quiet in the specific way that people are quiet when they have learned that speaking only gives others more material to work with. Invisible in the specific way that some people become invisible, not because nobody sees them, but because everyone has collectively decided that seeing them is optional. His name was Riku Hayashi, and he attended Harima High School, and he had exactly one friend, a boy named Shin Mori, who was small and underfed looking, and had chosen Riku's company in 7th grade with the simple logic of someone who understood that 2 invisible people were better than 1, and that friendship had held for 3 years through everything. Everything included Sora Takeda. Sora Takeda was 17 years old and the kind of person who had never once in his life wondered whether he belonged somewhere. Because belonging was something that happened around him rather than to him, rooms rearranged themselves when he entered. Conversations shifted toward him like plants toward light. Teachers smiled differently when he raised his hand. And the 12 students who orbited him at all times did so not because they particularly liked him, but because proximity to Sora Takeda was its own form of safety in the ecosystem of Harima High School. Riku had been Sora's preferred target for 8 months. Not because Riku had done anything, not because there was a reason, but because Sora had looked at him on the first day of high school and identified something useful, a target that wouldn't fight back, a punching bag that came to school voluntarily every day and made the whole enterprise convenient. Yuki Asano sat 2 rows from Riku in homeroom and had the kind of face that people described as gentle, warm brown eyes and dark hair, and a smile that she deployed carefully and never completely. And Riku had noticed her in the first week of school with the particular attention of someone who had nothing else to look at and nowhere else to direct his thoughts, and he had spent 8 months not saying a single word to her, because saying words to people like Yuki Asano was not something people like Riku Hayashi did. He didn't know yet that Yuki Asano hated herself every single day for what she had done to him. He didn't know a lot of things yet. It happened on a Tuesday in November, which was an ordinary day in every way that mattered, cold and gray and smelling of rain, the kind of day that doesn't announce itself as significant because significant days never do. Riku had stayed late after school to finish a makeup assignment in the library, which meant he was walking home alone at 5:47 p.m. through the back exit that most students didn't use, which meant nobody was around, which meant when Sora Takeda stepped out from beside the equipment shed with 5 members of his group behind him, there was nobody to see it and nobody to stop it. Sora looked at Riku the way he always looked at him, like something mildly interesting that required very little energy to deal with. And he said something that Riku would not remember later because the brain has a way of protecting itself from the specific words that break something permanently, and then the first push happened. Riku was used to pushes. He had cataloged them the way you catalog weather, an inevitable environmental condition that you endure rather than resist. But this push was harder than usual, and he stumbled back against the concrete wall of the equipment shed and his bag fell, and the contents scattered across the wet pavement. And something in Sora's expression shifted, something that recognized the absence of any consequence whatsoever and decided to find out exactly how far that absence extended. What followed lasted 4 minutes according to the timestamp on the security camera that nobody would check until the next morning. 4 minutes during which Riku Hayashi did not fight back, not because he couldn't have tried, but because trying had never once in his 16 years produced anything except more of the same, and the mathematics of futility had calcified into something he carried in his bones. He was on the ground when the last hit happened, a kick that connected with the side of his head against the concrete edge of the drainage channel running along the equipment shed wall, and the sound it made was wrong in a way that everyone present registered simultaneously, a sound that was different from the other sounds, a sound that had a different category entirely. And Sora Takeda took 1 step back and said nothing, and then turned and walked away with his group following him, because the alternative was standing there, and that was not something Sora Takeda was equipped to do. Riku lay on the wet pavement and looked up at the gray November sky, and felt something leaving him that he hadn't known was there until it started to go, and his last conscious thought was not about Sora Takeda, it was not about his parents, It was not about Shin, who would wonder tomorrow why he hadn't texted back. It was something smaller and more specific and more painful than any of those things. It was the memory of Yuki Asano's face 3 weeks ago when Sora had made Riku stand in the middle of the classroom and had told everyone to describe what they saw, and Yuki had looked at the floor and said nothing, and Riku had watched her look at the floor and understood that even the people who might have been kind had learned that kindness was a liability they couldn't afford. He closed his eyes on a Tuesday in November, and the gray sky disappeared, and he took exactly one more breath, and then he was gone. Riku Hayashi woke up to the sound of his alarm. This was wrong in several ways that his brain processed sequentially. First, that he had been dead, which made the alarm difficult to explain. Second, that the alarm was his school alarm, which meant it was 6:45 a.m. on a school day. Third, that when he opened his eyes, he was in his bedroom. His actual bedroom with the water stain on the ceiling he'd been meaning to tell his mother about, and the desk covered in textbooks he'd been meaning to organize, and the curtain his father had hung slightly crooked 2 years ago and never corrected. He sat up slowly, testing the experience of having a body, which was stranger than it sounds when the last thing you remember is not having one anymore. And he looked at his hands, and they were his hands, thick-fingered and familiar. And he looked in the mirror on the back of his door, and the face that looked back at him was his face, round and unremarkable, and exactly as it had always been. His phone was on the desk, and he picked it up and looked at the date, and the date was September 2nd, which was the first day of high school, which was 3 months before the Tuesday in November when he had died on the wet pavement behind the equipment shed at Harima High School. He sat with this information for approximately 90 seconds, and then something appeared in front of him that made the information make slightly more sense. A screen materialized in the air 2 feet from his face, sharp and clean, glowing with a blue-white light that made no shadow and cast no reflection, and the text on it was simple and direct in the way that impossible things sometimes are, it said. Iron Will System, activated, and below that, you were given 16 years and you spent them shrinking. You have been given a second chance. This time you will not shrink. And below that, in smaller text, the system does not fight for you. It does not protect you. It does not give you shortcuts. It gives you the tools and it demands the work. What you build is entirely yours. Begin. Riku read it 3 times, and then a new panel appeared beside the first one, labeled Current Stats, and it showed him numbers that he suspected were accurate in the way that impossible systems tend to be accurate about uncomfortable things. Strength, Level 1. Speed, Level 1. Endurance, Level 1. Willpower, Level 1. Combat, Ability, Level 0. The panel had a note below the numbers that said, "These are not insults, they are starting points. Every number on this screen can be changed. None of them can be changed without work. The work starts today." A third panel appeared labeled Daily Quest, and it said, Day 1, 50 push-ups, 50 sit-ups, 3-kilometer run, complete before midnight, failure penalty, weekly progress reset to 0. And below that, almost as an afterthought, you know what happens if you don't change anything, you already lived that version. Choose differently. Riku looked at the screen for a long time, and then he looked at his body in the mirror, and then he looked back at the screen, and then he did something he had not done in 3 years of being Riku Hayashi at Harima High School. He made a decision on purpose. He got up, put on his uniform, picked up his school bag, and walked downstairs to eat breakfast before the first day of high school, and the system screen followed him at the edge of his vision like a quiet promise. And for the first time in a very long time, Riku Hayashi was not afraid of what the day would bring. He was something else entirely, something that didn't have a comfortable name yet, but that felt, underneath everything, like the first molecule of a storm. Harima High School looked exactly as he remembered it, which was a strange thing to think about a place you were technically experiencing for the first time. And Riku stood at the gate for a moment and looked at it with the eyes of someone who already knew what was inside, who already knew which hallways belonged to which groups, which teachers noticed things, and which ones had decided noticing was someone else's job. And most importantly, which second-year student would walk through that gate at 8:12 a.m. and own the entire space the moment he entered it. Riku went inside. He found his homeroom, classroom 1B, and chose his seat with the deliberateness of someone who understood that the first seat you choose in a new school is a statement about who you think you are. And he chose a seat in the middle of the room, not the back where invisible people went to remain invisible, not the front where the performance of engagement happened, the middle, where someone might sit who had not yet decided what they were, but was considering the options. Shinmori came in at 8:09 and looked around the room with the expression of someone running probability calculations about where to sit, and his eyes landed on Riku, and something clicked in them the way things click when a decision makes itself. And he sat in the adjacent desk and said, "I'm Shin." And Riku said, "I'm Riku." And the friendship that had taken 3 weeks to form the first time formed in approximately 30 seconds this time, because Riku already knew which questions to ask, and Shin already was exactly the person Riku remembered him being. They were talking about something harmless and easy when the classroom door opened at 8:12 and Sora Takeda walked in. Riku had prepared himself for this moment in the shower that morning, had run through it in his head while eating breakfast, had told himself it was just a person entering a room, just a boy who didn't know yet what he was going to do, who had not yet done any of it, who was in this moment simply a 17-year-old student arriving at school. And all of that preparation did exactly nothing for the specific physical reaction that happened when Riku saw his face. The cold precision of recognition, the body remembering something the mind was trying to contextualize. Sora scanned the room the way he always did, quickly and completely, and his eyes passed over Riku without stopping, which was expected because Riku was nobody yet. And Sora moved to his seat with the ease of someone for whom movement through space had always been frictionless. Yuki Asano came in at 8:15 and sat 2 rows from Riku and didn't look at anyone in particular, and Riku watched her arrange her things with the contained precision of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. And he thought about the floor she had stared at 3 weeks before the day he died, and he thought about what she had told him in a conversation that hadn't happened yet but would, and he looked away before she could notice him looking. The homeroom teacher started the morning roll call, and Harima High School's first day began. And Riku Hayashi sat in his chair and breathed steadily and thought about the system panel hovering at the edge of his vision and the 50 push-ups waiting for him at home and the 3 kilometers waiting for him after that. And he thought about level 1 on every stat and what level 7 looked like and how many days separated those 2 numbers. And he thought about a Tuesday in November and the sound the last hit made. And he decided, with a clarity that surprised even him, that he was done being the kind of person that sound could be made to. The first incident happened on day 4, which was faster than last time but not surprising, because Sora's instincts for identifying useful targets operated below the level of conscious decision. He didn't choose people the way you choose a movie. He simply found himself drawn to them the way water finds the lowest point. It started in the cafeteria at lunch, which was where it always started. The cafeteria being the most socially legible space in any school. The place where every hierarchy was visible in the spatial arrangement of who sat where and who sat alone. And Riku was sitting with Shin at a corner table when Sora's group moved through, and Sora's shoulder connected with Riku's tray in the specific way that could be argued was an accident by anyone who hadn't seen it before. Last time Riku had said nothing and cleaned up the spilled food and sat back down and eaten what was left and spent the rest of the afternoon trying to be smaller than he already was. This time, Riku looked up and met Sora's eyes directly, which was not something Sora expected from someone sitting at a corner table, and the directness of it created a half-second pause in Sora's movement that his group noticed even if they didn't know what to make of it. Riku didn't say anything, and he didn't look away, and he didn't perform anger or defiance. He simply looked at Sora with the specific quality of someone who is seeing something clearly and filing it away, and then he looked back down at his food and continued eating. And Sora moved on, and the incident ended, and anyone watching would have said nothing happened. But something happened. Sora glanced back twice on the way to his table, which was not something Sora Takeda typically did, and Riku logged both glances in the running record he was keeping, and the system sent him a quiet notification at the edge of his vision that said, "Correct. Do not escalate. Do not shrink. The goal is not to win today. The goal is to still be standing when the day that matters arrives." Riku read the notification and ate his lunch and thought about the 3 kilometers he had run that morning at 5:30 a.m. before school. The first time in his life he had run 3 kilometers without stopping, and how his lungs had felt at the end of it, burning and real and entirely his, and how different that felt from everything else in his life. And he thought that maybe the system understood something about the difference between a battle and a war that he was only beginning to learn. After school, he went to the library, which was where he had been going every day since the system appeared, using the hour before his evening training to research, and what he was researching was Sora Takeda, not his social media or his reputation or the things that were visible, but the things underneath, the patterns, the tells, because combat prediction as a skill was listed in the system at level 0. And Riku had begun to understand that combat prediction didn't start in a ring, it started in a library, it started in the cafeteria. It started in the particular way someone glanced back twice when they expected 0 reaction and got something else. He ran his 3 kilometers after the library and did his push-ups and sit-ups in his room at night, and the system logged the completion, and the daily quest marker turned from red to green, and Riku Hayashi went to sleep on day 4 of his second chance feeling something that he was going to need several more weeks to correctly identify as the early architecture of confidence. He found Hideo Tanaka's gym on a Saturday in late September, which was 3 weeks into his second life, following a hand-lettered sign on a telephone pole that said, Tanaka MMA, serious students only, and an address that turned out to be a converted warehouse on the east side of the city that smelled of rubber mats and decades of effort. The system had given him his first week of quests, runs and push-ups and sit-ups and basic bodyweight exercises, but on day 8, a new section had appeared in the quest panel labeled Find a Teacher, with a note that said the system can give you structure, but it cannot give you knowledge. Knowledge requires a person find one, and Riku had spent a week looking before the telephone pole sign appeared. Hideo Tanaka was 40 years old and looked like someone had compressed 30 years of hard living into a body that had decided to become efficient about it, compact and still in the way that very confident people are still, with hands that looked like they had hit things professionally for a long time and eyes that assessed you before you finished walking through the door. He looked at Riku for approximately 4 seconds when Riku walked in on that Saturday morning, and then he said no. Riku said, I haven't asked anything yet. And Hideo said, I can see what you're going to ask. And the answer is no, I don't train beginners. I especially don't train beginners who look like they've never done anything physically demanding in their lives. Come back when you can run 5 kilometers in under 30 minutes and do 100 push-ups without stopping, and we'll talk. Riku said okay and left, and the system logged the interaction under a new category labeled Obstacles and marked it as in progress rather than failed, which Riku appreciated more than he expected. He came back the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that, and each time Hideo said something slightly different that amounted to the same thing, and each time Riku said okay and left and came back, and on the 4th Saturday Hideo looked at him for longer than 4 seconds and said, You keep coming back, and Riku said yes, and Hideo said why, and Riku thought about it and said, because I need to learn how to stop being hit, and Hideo was quiet for a moment, and then he said, That's an honest answer, come in. The first training session lasted 45 minutes, and Riku's body made its opinion of it known in every possible way, and when it was over, Hideo looked at him on the mat where he was lying and said, You have no natural ability whatsoever. Your footwork is non-existent, your balance is poor, your reflexes are average at best. And Riku said, I know, and Hideo said, good. People who know what they don't have are easier to teach than people who think they have things they don't. Come back Wednesday. The system updated immediately after the session. A new section appeared labeled Training Log, and a new stat appeared that hadn't been there before, labeled Technique, currently at level 0, with a note that said, This one is different from the others. Strength and speed you can build alone. Technique requires a teacher and cannot be shortcut. It grows only as fast as your understanding grows. Be patient. Riku read the note and thought about patience and how patience was a luxury he had spent 3 years having forced on him rather than choosing. And he thought that chosen patience felt very different from imposed patience. And he went home and ate dinner and did his evening exercises and went to sleep already thinking about Wednesday. The weeks that followed had a shape that Riku had never experienced before, which was the shape of something being built, incrementally and without shortcuts. The daily accumulation of small improvements that individually meant nothing and collectively meant everything. 5:30 a.m. Run, distance increasing by half a kilometer every week. First 3 kilometers, then 3.5, then 4. The route through the quiet pre-dawn streets becoming familiar in the specific way that routes become familiar when you run them alone in the dark with only your own breathing for company. School. Harima High School with all its architecture of hierarchy and all its inhabitants navigating it, Riku moving through it differently than he had the first time, not invisibly, but quietly, which was different. Invisible was the absence of presence, quiet was the management of it. The system's school-related notifications had started appearing in week 2, small observations logged at the corner of his vision during the day, things like Sora Takeda's left side is slower than his right. He protects his ribs habitually, This is information, and Riku had begun keeping a notebook, not about classes but about patterns, the way Sora moved, the way his group moved around him, the way the social ecosystem of Harima High School operated, who owed what to whom and why. 3 times a week, Hideo Tanaka's gym, where the education that couldn't come from the system was delivered in the specific direct language of someone who had spent 20 years learning the same things and had opinions about the most efficient way to transfer that knowledge. Hideo was not kind in the conventional sense, he was accurate, which was something Riku came to understand was better than kind. He told Riku exactly what was wrong and exactly what to do about it, and did not soften either message, and Riku absorbed both with the appetite of someone who had been starved of useful truth for a long time. Month 1. Footwork, endurance, basic defensive positioning, learning how to fall without getting hurt, learning where to put your hands, learning how to breathe when someone is trying to stop you from breathing. Month 2. Basic striking combinations, jab cross jab, the proper rotation of the hip, the physics of power transfer, the difference between hitting hard and hitting correctly, Hideo demonstrating in slow motion and then at speed, and then correcting Riku's version until it matched. Month 3. Sparring began, light contact at first, Hideo moving at 60% and Riku trying to survive contact with someone operating at 60%, which was more difficult than it sounds when the person operating at 60% had been a professional fighter for 2 decades. The system tracked everything in the training log, technique improving in small increments that were invisible day to day and visible month to month, the stat bars moving with the slow certainty of things that were actually changing rather than things that appeared to change. And Riku watched the numbers and thought about the Tuesday in November and thought about level 7 and kept going. His body changed in the way bodies change when you ask them consistently to do things they haven't done before. The weight redistributing itself, the shape underneath becoming something different. Not suddenly, not dramatically, slowly and then all at once in the way that most real things happen. And one morning in month 3, he looked in the mirror and the face looking back at him was recognizably his, but was not identical to the face he had started with. And he stood there for a moment and felt something that was not vanity but was adjacent to it. Something more like recognition, like meeting someone you had always suspected existed but had never been introduced to. Shin noticed in month 2, which was earlier than Riku expected, and cornered him after school with the expression of someone who had been performing calculations and had arrived at an answer that required verification. He said, "You're different," and Riku said, "Different how?" And Shin said, "I don't know exactly. You look different and you're more tired in the mornings and you keep looking at Sora Takeda like you're reading something." And Riku thought about how much to say and said, "I'm training." And Shin said, "Training what?" And Riku said, "MMA." And Shin was quiet for a long moment and then said, "Does this have something to do with what happened to you before you came here?" And Riku looked at him and said, "What do you mean?" And Shin said, "I don't know what I mean exactly. It's just that sometimes you seem like someone who already knows how a story ends and is trying to change the last chapter." And Riku said nothing for a moment, and then said something like that, and Shin said, "Okay," and then said, "I'm in, whatever you need, I'm in." And that was the end of the conversation, and the beginning of an alliance. By the end of month 3, the system's current stats panel looked different from the panel Riku had first seen on the morning of September 2nd. Strength, level 4. Speed, level 3. Endurance, level 5. Willpower, level 7. Technique, level 3. Combat ability, level 2. The willpower stat had reached level 7 first, which the system noted with a single line of text that said, "Willpower is the foundation, everything else is built on top of it, yours is now sufficient, the other numbers will follow." And Riku had looked at that notification for a long time, because it was the first time in his life that a number associated with him had been described as sufficient for anything. A new ability had appeared in the system at the end of month 2, the first one beyond the basic stats, labeled Pain Tolerance, Enhanced, with a description that said you have learned to continue when your body tells you to stop. This is not the same as being immune to pain. It is the ability to make a different decision about what pain means, use it correctly. Hideo had noticed the change before the system logged it, which was how Riku knew it was real rather than theoretical. Hideo had stopped a sparring session in week 9 and looked at him and said something changed. "You're not flinching the same way." And Riku said, "I've been working on it." And Hideo said, "I can see that," and went back to the session without further comment, which from Hideo was the equivalent of a standing ovation. The school situation had also changed, not dramatically but measurably. Sora's group had shifted the targeting pattern slightly toward easier responses, Riku's consistent non-reaction having removed some of the utility of the interaction. And while the incidents hadn't stopped, they had become less frequent and less escalating, which the system logged as threat assessment, reduced immediate risk, with a note that said, "This is not safety. This is a temporary equilibrium. Equilibriums shift. Stay prepared." Riku stayed prepared. Yuki Asano stopped him in the hallway on a Wednesday in month 2, which was not something that happened in the first version of this life. Yuki had existed in Riku's first life as a face he looked at, and a floor she looked at, and a memory he carried to the wet pavement, and so when she stepped out from beside the water fountain and said, "Riku, wait," it took him a moment to locate himself in the sequence of events. She looked at him with the warm brown eyes that were never fully warm, because something underneath them was always working, always managing, always performing a calculation about what was safe to show, and she said, "I've been watching you." And he said, "Okay," and she said, "You're different from how you look," and he said, "Most people are," and she said, "No, I mean specifically different, like, things you shouldn't know yet," and he said, "I don't know what you mean." And she looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable and said, "I think you do." He said nothing, and she seemed to make a decision, and she said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand that I'm telling you because I think you might be the only person in this school who would actually hear it," and he said, "Okay, tell me." She told him about Sora Takeda. Not the Sora that Harima High School saw, the easy smile and the athletic ability and the gravitational social pull, but the Sora underneath, the one who had found her in the first week of school with photographs he shouldn't have had, photographs of her family in a situation that she couldn't explain without destroying everything, and who had looked at her with the specific calm of someone who understood leverage and said simply that she would do what he needed her to do, or the photographs would find their way to the people they would hurt most. She had been doing what he needed her to do for 2 months, which included laughing when she wasn't supposed to laugh and looking at floors when she should have looked at people and saying things in group settings that left marks on people who hadn't deserved them, and every day she went home and sat with what she had become and found it increasingly difficult to locate the person she had been before Sora Takeda had found her. She said, "I was there the day he made you stand in the middle of the classroom, and I said nothing, and I looked at the floor. And I need you to know that I knew it was wrong and I did it anyway, and I have thought about it every day since." Riku listened to all of this and said nothing until she was finished, and then he said, "I know." And she looked at him sharply and said, "What do you mean you know?" And he said, "I mean I believe you," which was true even if it wasn't the complete answer. And she said, "I don't want your forgiveness, I don't deserve it yet. I just wanted you to know that not everyone who was silent because they wanted to be." And he said, "I understand that." And she said, "Do you?" And he said, "More than you know." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "I mean, what are you actually doing? Because you're different from month to month, and you look at Sora like you're solving a math problem, and you're not afraid of him the way everyone is afraid of him, and I want to know what you're doing." He said, "I'm preparing." And she said, "For what?" And he said, "For the day when the equilibrium shifts." And she didn't know what that meant, but something in the way he said it made her believe it was real. And she said, "Okay," and then said, "Is there anything I can do?" And he thought about it and said, "Yes, keep a record. Every time Sora asks you to do something, write it down with the date and what it was. Don't send it anywhere. Don't tell anyone. Just keep the record." And she said, "Okay." And that was the end of the conversation and the beginning of something that would matter considerably later. The weeks after the conversation with Yuki had a different texture than the weeks before it. Not because the external facts had changed, but because the internal map had expanded. Riku now moving through Harima High School with 2 parallel tracks of information running simultaneously, his own observations and the information Yuki fed him carefully in hallway moments and library encounters that looked from the outside like nothing in particular. Yuki was precise and detailed in the way that people are precise when they have been living inside a situation long enough to understand its architecture. She told him about the specific photographs Sora had, about the delivery mechanism he used to remind her of their arrangement, about the 2 other students she knew of who were in similar situations, about the patterns of when Sora escalated and when he was satisfied with passive compliance. The system added a new section to its interface labeled Intelligence, collected, and began cataloging the information, flagging connections and patterns that Riku filed alongside Hideo's training and his own observations into a growing picture of exactly who Sora Takeda was underneath the untouchable surface. The training continued, and the stat numbers continued their slow climb, strength reaching level 5 in month 4, speed reaching level 4, technique reaching level 4 after a breakthrough session with Hideo, where something about the hip rotation finally clicked into place, and Hideo had stopped the session and said, "That's it. You found it. Remember what that felt like. Everything else is built on that." And Riku had stood in the middle of the mat and felt it, the specific physical understanding that lives in the body rather than the mind, and logged it alongside everything else. Shin had become the third piece of the operation, though he didn't know the full scope of it, handling the school-facing logistics, the cover stories for Riku's early mornings and evening absences, and the careful social navigation of appearing to be two invisible students, while one of them was becoming considerably less invisible in ways that weren't yet apparent. The incidents with Sora's group had reduced further, 3 months of non-reaction having created a kind of mutual boredom around the dynamic, the group having found other entertainment, and Riku understood that this was temporary, and that temporary equilibriums existed to be disrupted, and that the disruption was coming, and that when it came, it needed to come on his terms rather than Sora's. He was thinking about this on a Friday afternoon in month 4, when Sora did something that changed the timeline. Shin had stayed late to help with a class project, which meant he was walking home alone at 5:30 p.m., which meant he was walking past the equipment shed when Sora's group found him. And what happened next was reported to Riku via a phone call from Shin's slightly shaking voice that said, "I'm okay, but you should know." And Riku listened and felt something crystallize in him that had been liquid for 4 months, something that went from preparation to decision in the space of a single phone call. He said to Shin, "Are you hurt?" And Shin said, "Not seriously." And Riku said, "Good," and then said, "I need you to do something for me." And Shin said, "Anything." And Riku said, "I need you to find out when the interfaculty MMA tournament is and whether independent entries are accepted." And Shin was quiet for a moment and then said, "I'll find out tonight." And Riku said, "Thank you," and hung up and looked at the system panel, and the system panel said simply, "It is time." The interfaculty MMA tournament at Harima High School was held every year in December and was the kind of event that the school administration described as an exhibition of athletic achievement, and that everyone who attended knew was primarily an occasion for Sora Takeda to remind the school who he was. Sora had won it 3 consecutive years, which had the effect of making his participation feel inevitable rather than competitive. The other entrants existing primarily to give the event the structure of a competition while providing no actual uncertainty about its outcome. Independent entries were accepted, which Shin confirmed on a Friday night with a text that said yes and an address for the registration office and a question mark that conveyed everything he wanted to ask without asking it. Riku registered on Monday morning before school, which was a Monday in early November, 3 weeks before the Tuesday when he had died the first time, and the registration form asked for name and year and weight class and emergency contact, and Riku filled it out with the specific care of someone doing something that cannot be undone and handed it to the administrator and walked to class. The information that Riku Hayashi had registered for the interfaculty MMA tournament moved through Harima High School at the speed that information about unexpected things always moves, which was immediately and completely. And by lunch on Monday, the entire school knew. And by the time Riku sat down with Shin in the cafeteria, the specific quality of the attention in the room had shifted in the way that attention shifts when something that doesn't make sense has happened and everyone is waiting to see if it will be explained. Sora found him after lunch in the hallway. He didn't bring his group, which was the first surprising thing, and he didn't perform his usual casual ownership of the interaction, which was the second surprising thing. He simply stopped in front of Riku and looked at him with the evaluating expression of someone genuinely trying to understand something, and he said, "I heard you registered," and Riku said yes, and Sora said why, and Riku said, "Because I want to compete," and Sora said, "You've never competed in anything in your life," and Riku said, "There's always a first time," and Sora looked at him for a long moment and said, "You're going to get hurt," and Riku said, "Probably," and Sora said, "I'm not going to go easy on you because of what you are," and Riku said, "I'm not asking you to." And something in Sora's expression shifted, something that recognized a variable it hadn't accounted for, and he said, "Okay," and walked away. The system logged the interaction under critical juncture, point of no return, and added a note that said the declaration is made. The preparation must now match it. You have 3 weeks. Use them. Riku used them. The 3 weeks between the registration and the tournament were the most concentrated period of preparation Riku had experienced. Hideo increasing the session intensity when Riku explained the timeline, which Hideo received with the expression of someone who had been waiting for this conversation and had prepared for it. Hideo said you have enough foundation to compete, he said. Not enough to be comfortable, but enough to compete. And there is a difference between those two things. Comfortable fighters make predictable decisions. Uncomfortable fighters sometimes make better ones because they have nothing to lose by trying something that shouldn't work. They worked on Sora specifically in those 3 weeks, Riku having compiled enough observation over 4 months to give Hideo a detailed behavioral profile of a fighter he had never seen. And Hideo had listened and processed and designed a game plan around the information. The left side slower than the right, the rib protection habitual, the escalation pattern when he felt control slipping, the specific way the footwork broke down under sustained pressure. The system had added a preview of what combat prediction would look like at higher levels. A description of a fighter who could read the micro-movements that preceded strikes and respond before the strike was completed. And Riku had spent the 3 weeks working on it deliberately for the first time. Hideo throwing combinations at 80%, and Riku trying to read the tells, the shoulder drop before the cross, the weight shift before the kick, the breath pattern before the combination. Small things that compounded into something that looked like prediction but was actually just very fast and very specific attention. Strength had reached level 6 by the end of week 2. Speed had reached level 5. Technique had reached level 5. Combat ability had reached level 4, and the system noted that level 4 combat ability in a structured training environment was not the same as level 4 combat ability under tournament pressure, and that the gap between those two things would be closed or revealed on the day of the tournament, and that there was no way to know which until it happened. On the morning of the second week of preparation, he woke up at 5:30 a.m. as he always did, and went to the mirror as he always did. And what he saw stopped him in a way that the mirror had not stopped him in a long time. Because the person looking back at him was not the person who had started this in September. Not the overweight 16-year-old who had stood in the same spot and understood for the first time that something had to change. This was someone else. Someone he had been building toward without fully tracking how close he was getting. The system sent a notification he hadn't asked for, appearing full screen in the way it reserved for significant updates, and it said, Iron Will System, Physical Adaptation Milestone. And below that, 5 months of consistent training has produced a cumulative physical transformation that your daily increments made difficult to perceive. You have been changing faster than you were able to notice. This is what the work looks like from the outside. This is what you built. And below that, simply, the person in the mirror is not a reward. He is a result. Treat him accordingly. Riku stood in front of the mirror for a long time, not with vanity, not with triumph, but with the specific quiet of someone who has just received confirmation that the thing they believed was possible was actually possible. And then he put on his training clothes and went to run his 5 kilometers in the pre-dawn dark, the same as he did every morning. Because the mirror was information, and information was useful, and the tournament was still 9 days away, and there was still work to do. Yuki gave him the final piece of the intelligence picture in week 2, a detailed record of 14 months of Sora Takeda's arrangement with her and 2 other students, dates and requests and specific language, documented with the precision of someone who had understood from the beginning that documentation might eventually matter, and Riku took the record and gave a copy to Shin and told him what to do with it and when, and Shin read it and said, "This is serious." And Riku said yes. And Shin said, "We need to be careful about timing," and Riku said, "I know, December 15th, not before." December 15th was the day of the tournament. Riku woke up on December 15th at 5:30 a.m. as he had woken up every morning for 4 months, which meant his body had no particular opinion about the significance of the day and simply executed the routine, and he lay in bed for exactly 1 minute before getting up, which was the amount of time he had learned he needed to locate himself before the day began. The system had sent its first notification of the day before the alarm went off, which was unusual, and it said, "Today is the day you prepared for. Everything between September 2nd and today has been about today. You have done the work is done. What happens now is what the work produces. Trust it." He read it twice and got up. The face in the mirror was not the face from September 2nd, which he had understood intellectually for months, but which still had the capacity to surprise him when he met it directly. The roundness redistributed, the jaw more defined, the eyes carrying something that hadn't been there at the beginning. Not confidence, exactly. More like the physical expression of someone who had been tested consistently and had not stopped, which was different from confidence because confidence could exist without being tested, and this couldn't. His phone had a message from Shin that said, "I have everything ready. I'll be at the school at 9 a.m., don't worry about anything except the fighting part," and a message from Yuki that said nothing, just a single period, which he had learned to read as her version of, "I'm here." He ate breakfast and took his training bag and walked to Harima High School on a cold December morning, 3 weeks after the Tuesday when he had died the first time. And the school was already alive with the specific energy of a day when something was going to happen. Students clustering in groups and looking at their phones and generating the particular noise of a collective that was waiting. Riku walked through the gate and through the noise into the registration table outside the gymnasium where the tournament would be held, and he gave his name, and the administrator found it on the list, and he went inside to prepare, and the system sent one final notification before going silent for the rest of the day, and it said simply, "You know what to do, we both know you know, go do it." The gymnasium at Harima High School had been converted for the tournament, with a central mat area surrounded by folding chairs that were filled to capacity by the time the first match began. Students and some faculty arranged in the specific social geography of Harima High, Sora's group occupying the prime positions near the mat with the proprietary ease of people who considered the event to belong to them. Riku's first match was against a second-year student named Goto, who was athletic and technically competent, and who had clearly not prepared for the possibility that the fat first year from Homeroom 1B would be a serious opponent, which was the first tactical advantage of the day, the gap between what people expected to see and what they actually saw. The match lasted 4 minutes. Riku won by decision. The crowd's reaction to this was the specific silence of people recalibrating, the noise dropping for a moment as the result registered and then returning at a different pitch, a pitch that contained questions that hadn't been there before. His second match was against a third-year student who was faster and more experienced and who took Riku seriously from the opening bell, which meant the match was genuinely difficult and required everything Hideo had given him, the footwork and the pain tolerance and the reading of patterns, and it went all 3 rounds and Riku won by split decision and came off the mat breathing harder than he would have liked but standing, which was the only requirement. Between matches he sat in the corner Shin had claimed for him, and Shin gave him water and said nothing because Shin had learned when silence was more useful than speech, and Riku breathed and let the system's training log run its post-match assessment and looked at the mat where Sora's semi-final was finishing, watching the footwork and the rib protection and the specific tell before the right cross, confirming everything he had cataloged over 4 months. Sora won his semi-final in 2 minutes, which the crowd met with the response they had been trained to give, and he looked across the mat at Riku with the evaluating expression that had appeared in the hallway when Riku had registered, and Riku met it directly and looked away first, not because he was afraid, but because there was nothing useful in staring, and everything useful in conserving energy for the next 40 minutes. The system sent a single notification during the break that said, "Combat prediction is now active at level 3, which means you will see the tells but you will need to trust what you see. The failure mode is disbelieving your own perception. Don't disbelieve it." Riku read it and closed his eyes for 4 minutes and breathed and let himself become very quiet inside. The specific internal quiet that Hideo had spent 2 months trying to teach him and that he had finally found in month 3, and that was now something he could locate reliably, and when the referee called the finalists, he opened his eyes and stood up and walked to the mat. Sora Takeda entered the mat from the opposite side, and the crowd's response to him was everything it had always been, immediate and unreserved, and he acknowledged it with the ease of someone for whom applause was a background condition rather than an event, and he looked at Riku with an expression that contained something new alongside the evaluation. Something that Riku identified after a moment as respect, not for Riku specifically, but for the fact of his presence here, which Sora had apparently decided merited a category distinction from his previous assessment. The referee called them to center mat and read the rules and asked if they were ready, and they both said yes, and the match began. Round 1 was Sora establishing what he was, fast and technically precise, and physically stronger than Riku by a margin that the first 30 seconds made clear. And Riku's job in round 1 was to survive it, and learn from it, and not give Sora anything that ended the match early, which he did, taking 2 significant hits and returning 2 and spending the round moving and watching and cataloging. The left side slower than the right? Confirmed. The rib protection habitual? Confirmed. The breath pattern before the combination? Confirmed. The weight shift before the kick that the system had flagged as his most dangerous weapon? Confirmed. Combat prediction at level 3 meant that Riku could see the tells approximately half a second before the strikes arrived, which sounds like a small margin and is in fact an enormous one, half a second being the difference between eating a strike and not eating it, between a match that ends in round 1 and a match that goes to round 3. Round 2 was where Riku began to impose, not through power because Sora's power advantage remained real, but through positioning and prediction, slipping the right cross 3 times in succession by reading the tell, which caused something to happen in Sora's expression that Riku had been waiting for. The specific micro-expression of someone who cannot explain what is happening and is beginning to feel the edges of uncertainty. Uncertainty in a fighter who has never been uncertain is a compounding problem. Hideo had told him this in month 3, because the response to uncertainty in someone like Sora is escalation, and escalation breaks the technical discipline, and technical discipline is what makes him dangerous. Take away the discipline and what you have is a bigger, stronger, angrier version of a problem you can solve. Riku took away the discipline. The escalation came in the middle of round 2, Sora overcommitting to a combination that Riku read 3 beats in advance and stepped around, landing a counter to the ribs that was the cleanest strike of the match. And the crowd went quiet in the way crowds go quiet when something unexpected happens to an expected outcome. And Sora reset and breathed, and Riku could see him recalibrating, and the recalibration itself was information. Round 3 was the round that would decide it, both of them knowing this, the score close enough that the round would carry the match, and Riku went into it with everything left, the willpower at level 7 being the thing that carried him through the first 2 minutes when Sora found another gear and pushed, and Riku absorbed and kept moving, kept reading, kept trusting what combat prediction was showing him. The moment that decided it came with 40 seconds remaining, Sora throwing the kick that the system had flagged as his most dangerous weapon, the weight shift preceding it visible to Riku 2 beats before it arrived, and Riku did what Hideo had told him to do if this moment came. He stepped into it instead of away from it, inside the arc where the power died, and through the combination that he had drilled 500 times in the converted warehouse on the east side of the city, with the man who had told him he had no natural ability whatsoever and then spent 4 months building him anyway. The combination landed. Sora didn't fall. He was not the kind of fighter who fell from a single combination, but he took a step back, and the step back was enough, the round ending with the score on the right side of the line. And when the referee raised Riku's hand, the gymnasium at Harima High School produced the specific noise of a crowd that has just watched something it didn't expect and doesn't have a ready-made response for. The system sent nothing. It had said it would go silent for the day, and it kept that. And Riku stood in the middle of the mat and breathed and felt the thing that 4 months of work had been building toward, which was not triumph exactly. It was simpler than triumph. It was the specific physical certainty of someone who did what they said they would do. Quiet and complete and entirely his. Sora found him 20 minutes after the match in the hallway outside the gymnasium, without his group, which was the second time he had approached Riku alone, and which meant something different than it had the first time. He looked at Riku with the expression of someone who had been doing significant internal recalibration and said, "I want to know how you did that," and Riku said, "I prepared." And Sora said, "I prepare too," and Riku said, "I know. But you prepared to be Sora Takeda, and I prepared to beat him, and those are different preparations." Sora was quiet for a moment and then said, "You're different from what I thought you were," and Riku said, "I know what you thought I was," and Sora said, "Yeah," and Riku said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen to all of it before you respond." And Sora looked at him and said, "Okay." Riku told him about Shin, who was at that moment walking into the school director's office with a copy of Yuki's 14-month record of Sora's arrangement with her and 2 other students, dates and requests and specific language, documented with the precision of someone who had understood from the beginning that documentation would eventually matter. He told Sora that the director was reading it now, and that a copy had been sent to the school board, and that Yuki and the other 2 students had agreed to speak to the appropriate authorities, and that the photographs Sora had were the kind of thing that authorities took seriously, and that the architecture of what Sora had built over 14 months was in the process of being carefully dismantled. Sora listened to all of it and said nothing for a long time, and then he said, "You planned this. And Riku said yes, and Sora said from the beginning, and Riku said from the beginning, and Sora said, "Why didn't you just report it? Why all of this?" And Riku looked at him and said, "Because reporting it without everything I spent 4 months building would have been one student's word against yours. And words without evidence don't move the kind of untouchable you had made yourself, and I needed you to no longer be untouchable before the words could matter." Sora stood in the hallway and looked at him and said nothing more, and Riku walked past him toward the exit, and behind him he heard Sora say quietly something that might have been, "I didn't know you were like this." And Riku didn't stop and didn't turn around because there was nothing useful in the response and everything useful in what came next. Sora Takeda was suspended pending investigation on December 16th, which was the day after the tournament, the school board having received Yuki's documentation and the corroborating accounts of the 2 other students with the kind of urgency that institutions produce when something surfaces that could become a problem for them if not addressed quickly. The group that had orbited Sora for 2 years dissolved with the speed that groups dissolve when the gravitational center is removed, some members retreating into ordinary studenthood with apparent relief, some attempting to relocate themselves in the social ecosystem with varying success, none of them filling the specific vacuum that Sora's absence created, because vacuums of that kind are not fillable by committee. The school was different in the weeks after the tournament, not dramatically, not in ways that made the news, but in the specific texture of daily life, the hallways having a different quality, the cafeteria seating arrangements shifting in small ways that added up to something measurable. The general atmospheric pressure of Harima High School reduced by some amount that was difficult to quantify and easy to feel. Riku moved through it the same way he had moved through everything for 4 months, quietly and observantly, the external facts having changed without requiring him to perform a change in response, the person he had built still being the person who was useful now that the specific opposition that had required his building was no longer present. Hideo Tanaka heard about the tournament from a student at the gym and called Riku the evening of December 16th, and the conversation was brief, Hideo saying "you won," and Riku saying yes, and Hideo saying "good." And then after a pause, "I want to talk about what comes next," and Riku said "so do I," and they agreed to meet on Saturday. The system had been quiet since the tournament, the daily quest panel empty for the first time since September 2nd, which Riku had expected. The system having told him from the beginning that it was a tool and not a destination, and the absence of it felt like the specific quiet after music stops, noticeable in a way that made the music's presence retroactively apparent. On the evening of December 16th, he sat at his desk and looked at the space where the system panel had appeared on September 2nd, and thought about what level 1 on every stat had felt like, and thought about the specific sound that the last hit had made on a Tuesday in November, and thought about the face in the mirror that morning that was recognizably his, but was not identical to the face he had started with. And he felt something that was not satisfaction exactly, satisfaction being too simple for what had actually happened. He felt something more like the specific weight of having done something that cost what it cost, and being sure it had been worth it. Yuki found him at the library on a Thursday afternoon, which was a week after the tournament, and she sat across from him at the study table and didn't say anything immediately, which was her way. And he waited because he had learned that waiting was what her particular kind of conversation required. She said "thank you," and he said "you don't have to." And she said "I know I don't have to, I want to." And he said "okay." And she said "I've been trying to figure out what to say to you for a week, and I keep running into the problem that what you did for me was so much larger than anything I know how to match with words." And he said "you don't need to match it." And she said "I know, but I want you to understand that I know what it cost. Not just the training and the time, but the carrying of it. Knowing what was happening to me and to the others and not being able to move until you were ready to move." And he said it wasn't easy. And she said "I know." And then she said, "There's something else I want you to know." She said "I recognized you, not from before," she said carefully. "Not from anything that makes logical sense. But from the beginning of this year, there was something in the way you looked at things that felt like someone who already understood the cost of them. And I didn't know what to do with that recognition, so I watched. And what I watched was someone who had decided to become something on purpose." And she said, "I don't know what happened to you before September 2nd, but I know something happened and I know it changed the direction you were heading in." And she said, "I'm glad it did, because the direction you were heading in before was going to end somewhere that neither of us wanted it to end." He looked at her across the library study table and thought about the wet pavement and the gray November sky and the floor she had stared at and the record she had kept for 14 months, and the single period she had sent him on the morning of the tournament. And he said, "I'm glad too." And she said, "Where do we go from here?" And he said, "I think we find out." And she said, "That's not an answer." And he said, "It's the most honest one I have." And she looked at him for a moment and then said, "Okay," and then said, "I can work with that." The system appeared one final time on the evening of December 22nd, which was the last day of school before winter break, appearing in the full-screen format it had used for significant messages rather than the edge-of-vision notification format of daily quests. It said, "Iron Will System, Final Assessment," and below that, "You began this second chance at level 1 in every category. You ended at the following," and the stats appeared: Strength level 6, Speed level 5, Endurance level 7, Willpower level 8, Technique level 5, Combat Ability level 5, Combat Prediction level 4, Pain Tolerance Enhanced, and below the stats a single line that said, "These numbers are yours. They were built by you. They cannot be taken by anyone. They go where you go." Below that, a final message, the last thing the system would ever say to Riku Hayashi, and it said, "You were given a second chance because you died with something unfinished." The unfinished thing was not revenge. Revenge was the mechanism. The unfinished thing was the version of yourself that you never got to be because the circumstances of your first life didn't allow it. That version now exists. It is standing in your mirror every morning. It will continue to exist because you built it from the inside rather than waiting for it to be given to you from the outside. This system is no longer needed. You are no longer the person who needed it. Go live the life the work produced. The screen went dark. Riku sat in his room in the quiet of December 22nd and looked at the empty air where the system had been and felt the specific finality of something that had served its purpose being released. And he thought about September 2nd, and he thought about the warehouse on the east side of the city, and Hideo's hands and Shin's loyalty, and Yuki's documentation, and the single period she had sent him on tournament morning. And he thought that the story he had lived the first time and the story he had lived the second time were the same story told differently, and that the difference was not in what happened to him, but in what he decided to do about it, and that this was possibly the most important thing he had ever understood. He picked up his phone and texted Shin, "Winter break starts tomorrow. Do you want to run in the morning?" And Shin replied in 3 minutes, "Yes, 5:30. Don't be late." And Riku smiled and set his alarm and went to sleep. Spring came to Harima High School the way spring always came, gradually and then completely, the temperature shifting by degrees that were individually imperceptible and collectively undeniable, and with it the particular quality of light that made everything look slightly more possible than it had in winter. Riku ran his 5 kilometers at 5:30 a.m., the same as he ran them every morning. The route familiar now in the way that chosen things become familiar, comfortable without being comforting, known without being finished. And he finished the run and stood in the cool spring air, breathing steadily, and thought that this was one of the small things he had not expected to find in his second chance, the specific satisfaction of a body that does what you ask of it, which sounds simple and is not simple at all when you have spent 16 years treating your body as an inconvenience rather than an instrument. Hideo had asked him in January what he wanted to do next, now that the original goal had been achieved, and Riku had thought about it for a week before answering, which Hideo had waited for without impatience, because Hideo understood the difference between a question that needed time and a question that needed a quick answer. And Riku had said, "I want to compete." Actually compete, not for a reason external to the competition, but because I want to find out what I'm capable of when there's nothing else at stake. And Hideo had said that's the right answer, and they had started building toward a regional amateur tournament in the spring. Shin was still Shin, which was the most reliably good thing in Riku's life. Small and underfed looking and strategically excellent and loyal in the uncomplicated way of someone who had decided early that loyalty was simply part of his character and had never revisited the decision. And they ran together 3 mornings a week now, and Shin complained about the pace every single time and matched it every single time. And Riku found this deeply and consistently funny. Sora Takeda had transferred to a different school in January, the investigation having produced consequences that made his position at Harima High School untenable, and his departure had the quality of an exhale, something that everyone had been holding without realizing they were holding it, releasing all at once, and the school had reorganized itself around his absence with the resilience of ecosystems that were healthier without the element that had been dominating them. Yuki walked to school with Riku on a Tuesday morning in April, which was something that had been happening 2 or 3 times a week since January, both of them living in adjacent neighborhoods, and both of them leaving at the same time, and both of them having discovered that the walk was better with company than without it. And she was telling him something about a story she was writing for the literary club that he was listening to, with the specific quality of attention that she had once identified as the thing that made him different from most people. And she was right that it was different. It was the attention of someone who understood that moments were not infinite, and had decided to be inside them rather than watching them from a distance. She said the ending is the part I can't figure out. And he said, what's the problem with it? And she said it resolves too easily. The character gets what she wants. And it feels like the story is saying that's the resolution. And he said maybe the resolution isn't about getting what she wants. And she said, what do you mean? And he said, maybe the resolution is about becoming someone who knows how to want something without it consuming her. The wanting being the character development and the getting being almost incidental. And Yuki walked quietly for a moment and then said that's exactly right and also extremely annoying. And he said, I know. And she laughed. The real one. The one that she had learned to stop hiding sometime around December. And he thought that this was what the system had been pointing toward all along. Not the tournament and not the stats and not the architecture of accountability that had dismantled Sora Takeda's operation. But this. A Tuesday morning in April with cherry blossom trees beginning to bloom along the route to school, and a person beside him who laughed the real laugh, and a body that ran 5 kilometers before dawn, and a life that he was living rather than enduring. The system had said what you build is entirely yours, and he thought about this often. Thought about the difference between things that are given and things that are built. Thought about level 1 on every stat and the face in the morning mirror that was recognizably his, but was not identical to the face he had started with. And he thought that the version of himself that existed now was not something that had been granted to him by the second chance. The second chance had only provided the conditions. The version of himself had been built day by day at 5:30 a.m. in the dark, and in a converted warehouse on the east side of the city, and in a library cataloging patterns, and in 1,000 small decisions to keep going when stopping was available as an option. You were always capable of this, the system had said. You just needed to know what mattered. He knew what mattered. Yuki said, hey, are you listening? And he said, yes, and she said, what was I saying? And he said, the ending of your story, the character learning to want without being consumed by the wanting. And she said, okay, good, you were listening. And he said, I'm always listening. And she said, I know, that's the thing about you. And she smiled and looked at the cherry blossoms beginning to bloom along the path to school, and he looked at them too, and thought that this was enough. This specific Tuesday morning in April was enough, and that he intended to be inside everyone that followed it rather than watching from a distance. Riku Hayashi, who had died on a Tuesday in November with a life unlived, was standing in the middle of a Tuesday in April with a life that was entirely his own, built from the inside, carried in his body, expressed in every morning he chose to get up before dawn and run. It was enough. It was everything.